In this lesson, we're going to learn how we can start to use some textures within the render tree as a way of shaping the density of our volumetric particles. Alright, so picking up where we left off in our previous lesson, we have these volumetric particles that have been simulated and have some nice shading to them, but really there's not a whole lot of definition to the shape. It's really just kind of a bunch of blobs. So what we can start to do is actually take advantage of some textures in the render tree to start to really give this some nice, interesting, really complex shapes. So let's start by just selecting the point cloud. I'm going to open up the render tree, just press 7 on my keyboard. And what we can start to do is start to utilize some of these textures. So if we scroll down, there are a few of these textures that have the scalar name applied to them. So cell scalar, fractal scaler, these are actually really good for being able to shape the density of our particles. So let's start with something like the fractal scaler. So all we have to do is take this fractal scaler and take this and plug this into the shape density of our particle density node. Or if you're using the particle renderer compound, we can take this fractal scaler and just simply plug that into the density shape. So whichever method you happen to be using, it's really pretty simple to plug in. Now, once we have this plugged in, all we should have to do is now render, and now we can start to see a lot of different shapes immediately within this particle cloud. So let's come in and start to work on this fractal scaler. Now if we view this, we can actually see what this texture looks like, and we can start to see maybe just a little bit of relation between the color here and the result of these density shapes. So let's come in to this fractal scaler and maybe just start to make a few minor adjustments to this. You'll notice that as we start to bring this clamp maximum down, that starts to introduce a lot more white into this, which makes the density start to really thicken up. As we start to bring the clamp minimum up to a little bit higher value, we're now introducing a little bit more black into this. And again, you can start to see now a little bit more of a relationship between this. So what I'm going to try to do is just kind of tighten this up a little bit. There we go. If we want to, we can start to increase this bias, which as we start to raise this up to a little bit higher value, that'll start to add some little sharper edges along these edges, wherever these fractal patterns start to come into contact with each other. So really low bias starts to kind of soften this up. Alright, very nice. We can also come in, and if we needed to, we could switch these colors around within the fractal. So we can also come into the noise tab. Now this is where we can actually start to gain quite a bit of control over the actual look. We can actually change this from a fractal sum noise to something like a turbulence, which will give us a slightly different noise pattern. Now you may have to go back once we make this change and come back to the clamp minimum and maximum values, because these do behave a little bit differently for the turbulence texture. Here we go. And you can see with the turbulence we get something that is a little bit sharper and a little bit longer as far as some of these striations go. So let's maybe come in and try switching these colors around. There we go. I'm just trying to introduce a little bit more of a definite pattern in here, so we can actually start to really see some of these different shapes. So some really nice complex shapes that we can start to create very quickly using just this really simple texture. Now, one of the things that is really important to keep in mind whenever applying any kind of a texture in as your particle density is that these textures are very heavily affected by the size of your particles. So there's a direct relationship between the scaling of your particles and how that texture fits on them. So normally these textures will scale according to the size of your particles. So what we should start to see is in a situation like this where we've actually applied in one of our earlier lessons the ability for these particles to grow over time, where these particles start off really small down at the base and start to get a little bit larger up toward the top. If we were to render this out, what we should see is a really clear relationship between the texture and the size of your particles. So up here where these particles are larger, we can see quite a bit more in the actual pattern of these fractal scalar shapes, versus as we start to get down lower, as these particles get smaller and smaller, you notice that this pattern in the fractal scalar also gets smaller and smaller. So just keep in mind that from scene to scene, depending on the size of your particles, you may wind up having to use some different values for your fractal scalar. attributes. Okay, so let's come back and maybe just close that out. We also have in the Fractal Scaler the texture support. Now this is another thing that's really important because, again, depending on your particular scene, you may wind up in a situation where you need to get larger or smaller fractal patterns depending on your particular situation and, again, depending on the size of your particles. So if we go into the texture support tab, we have the scale. So as we start to bring the scale down, this should start to actually increase the size of our fractal patterns. So you can start to see now some larger patterns beginning to appear as we start to bring this down, versus as we start to increase this, our pattern starts to get more and more refined. So again, just depending on your particular scene and your particular situation, you may wind up having to come in and definitely play with these values until you find something that works for you. Now, if we want to, we could actually disconnect this relationship between the scale of your particles and the size of this density texture. So let's select the point cloud. Again, I'll press 7 on my keyboard to open up the render tree. And remember, in one of our earlier lessons, I had mentioned that this particle density node really has a lot of control over the density, and once we have a texture plugged into this, this has a lot to do with the way that density is going to be mapped onto this particle cloud. So if we want to make any changes to the way that this texture flows across the surface, this more often than not will be something that's found inside the particle density node. So if we open up the particle density, we should have this texture coordinate tab. Now if we go into this, by default, this scale with particle size option is turned on. So what we should see is, if we were to just collapse this and move this over, if I middle click and save this for comparison, let me come in and disable this scale with particle size. And now what we should start to see is that this size remains pretty much uniform all throughout. So if we go back to the Fractal Scaler and start to bring this scale down, again, remember this value needs to come to a lower value if we want our fractal pattern to be larger. And as this starts to come down, we now see a much more uniform relationship between the size of the density up at the top of the particle versus the size down here. You can see there's really no more relationship between the scale. So again, just depending on your particular situation, if you need to enable this or disable this, you do have that capability. Now, if you are using the particle renderer compound, you'll notice that this option does not actually exist. So if you want to have this kind of control over the particle density, we just have to go inside of this compound by just editing the compound, and then we can just access the particle density node inside. And now we have that tab right in here. Alright, so we do have, like I said, a few of these different textures we can use. A cell scaler is another good one, but a lot of times I find the cell scaler and the fractal scaler are really good to use, and really very rarely do I have to use anything other than these. Now if we take a look inside this particle tab once again, we do have this compound called the particle shaper. Now this particle shaper, if we were to take a look inside of this, is really nothing more than a few of these fractals for things like the fractal scaler, the cell scaler, and really all that really has been done is that a few of these different fractals have been mixed together into one single node. So these have been sort of combined, and if we were to view the result of that, this really gives us a pretty good starting point for getting nice billowy clouds. So again, just like the situation that we had in one of our earlier lessons with the particle volume cloud and the particle density, the way that these have been packaged into this particle renderer compound, we have the same situation with the particle shaper and some of these fractal scalar nodes. We just have a few of these that have been kind of assembled and packaged together into this particle shaper compound. And as we start to get into some of our later lessons, we're going to learn just how we can actually take several of these different fractal nodes and combine these together in our own way so that we can really kind of start to make our own versions of this particle shaper compound. So this really works just like the standard fractal scaler. Just take the density and plug this into the shape density of our particle density node, or it can also plug into the density shape of our particle renderer compound. And you can see it starts to give us some kind of billowy cloud type effects. But if we come into the particle shaper, we do have sort of an irregular shape. So this is one of the fractals that have been mixed in here. We also have the cell shape, and again, we have full control over the texture scale and things like that, as well as the fractal shape, which gives us sort of these wispy looks. And we also have a couple of presets over here as well, so if we wanted to get sort of billowing clouds, just very quickly, and again, depending on the size of your particles, this does make a very significant impact on the look of your texture. So this may look very, very different for your particular scene if your particles happen to be larger or smaller than the ones I'm using in my scene. Alright, so that's just a quick look at how we can start to take some of these textures within the render tree and start to use these to very quickly start to add some really, really intricate shapes into the density of our volume particles.